Berempur was a village of striking beauty, tucked away in the scenic valleys of Madhya Pradesh. Yet, beneath its peaceful exterior lay a darkness that had haunted its residents for generations. The village was home to secrets so terrifying that even the most courageous individuals of that century lived in a state of constant, underlying dread. These were not just stories told to children to keep them indoors. They were warnings etched into the very soul of the community, passed down by those who knew that some shadows were meant to stay undisturbed. On a particular Saturday night, a young man named Madden was preparing to leave his family home. He was filled with excitement because his friends from the city were visiting after a long separation. They were scheduled to leave at dawn, and Madden felt he could not miss this rare chance to spend the night laughing and drinking with them. To him, the night represented a temporary escape from the quiet, monotonous life of the village. He dressed quickly, his mind already at the gathering, imagining the stories they would swap and the camaraderie they would share. However, as he reached the door, his father's voice stopped him in his tracks. His father's face was a map of anxiety, his eyes filled with a deep ancestral fear. He warned Madden that tonight was no ordinary night. It was Saturday, the night when the legends grew teeth. He spoke of the Nishir Molo, entities that were said to wander the outskirts of the village. Madden, typical of his youth, laughed off the warning. He told his father that whether it was the Nishir Molo or Narkasur himself, no ghost story was going to keep him from his friends. He mocked the villagers for living as if they were still in the 2nd century, bound by superstitions that he believed had no basis in reality. His father, realizing that fear for his son's safety outweighed his frustration at Madden's arrogance, gave him a stern and specific set of instructions. He told Madden that if he heard the heavy thud of footsteps or a low, rhythmic chanting, he must act instantly. He was told to hide in a place where he could neither see the source of the noise nor be seen by it. He was instructed to remain perfectly still until the sounds completely vanished into the night air. The father described the horror in detail, 4 terrifying men carrying a coffin upon their shoulders. He warned that any living soul who laid eyes upon them would never survive to tell the tale. Madden gave a dismissive nod and hurried out into the night, leaving his father standing in the doorway, gripped by a terrible premonition. To save time, Madden decided to take a shortcut through a narrow, overgrown trail that cut directly through the dense forest. He walked with a brisk pace, his footsteps crunching on the dry leaves, his thoughts entirely focused on the fun that awaited him. He felt invincible, convinced that the forest held nothing but trees and shadows. As he reached the heart of the woods, the playful atmosphere he had created in his mind suddenly dissolved. The silence of the forest was pierced by a heavy, rhythmic thud, the sound of boots hitting the earth in perfect unison. Then came the voices, low and guttural, chanting a mantra that seemed to vibrate through the very air. The sudden reality of his father's warning hit Madden like a physical blow. His heart hammered against his ribs, and cold sweat broke out across his forehead. Terrified, he scrambled toward a thick patch of bushes and threw himself inside, pressing his body against the damp earth. The chanting grew louder, more rhythmic and more menacing as the figures approached. Despite the life-saving advice he had been given, curiosity, or perhaps a cruel trick of fate, compelled Madden to look. He slowly parted the leaves and peered out with a single eye. His blood turned to ice. Passing just a few feet away were 4 figures, their movements mechanical and grim, supporting a heavy wooden coffin on their shoulders. They moved with a singular, terrifying purpose, their voices rising and falling in the chilling chant. Madden quickly pulled back, covering his mouth to stifle his frantic breathing, praying to a god he had ignored hours ago. After what felt like an eternity, the chanting faded and the forest became deathly quiet once more. Madden waited for a long time before he dared to move. He slowly crept out of the bushes, looking left and right. The path was empty. He breathed a sigh of relief, convinced he had cheated death. He took 1 step forward, intending to run back home, but the sound of heavy footsteps exploded directly behind him. The chanting resumed, louder than ever, right at his back. He spun around in a panic and found himself staring directly at the four coffin bearers. They stood inches away, their presence radiating an ancient, cold malice. A single, horrified scream tore from Madden's throat, echoing through the trees before being abruptly cut short. Back at the house, the father's worry turned into a certainty of tragedy when Madden failed to return. He called upon a fellow villager named Vipul, and together they ventured into the dark forest with lanterns. Their search eventually led them to a massive, ancient banyan tree. There they stopped, paralyzed by what they saw. Madden was found in a state that defied natural explanation. His body was there, but his face was a distorted mask of absolute, paralyzing horror. His eyes were wide and vacant, as if the last thing they had reflected was a sight so monstrous it had shattered his soul. The legend of the coffin bearers was no longer a story to the father. It was the thief that had stolen his son. 4 centuries had passed since the tragic night under the banyan tree, and the world had moved into an era of science and skyscrapers. In the heart of Delhi, a young woman named Meghna lived a life far removed from the superstitions of the past. However, her nights told a different story. For weeks, she had been trapped in a cycle of vivid, terrifying nightmares that felt more like a haunting than a dream. Every night, the vision was the same. She would find herself standing alone in a vast, dark forest where a thick fog clung to the ground, obscuring her path. The silence of the woods was heavy and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic sound of a mysterious liquid falling from a height. In her dream, she would wander through the mist, her voice trembling as she called out to see if anyone was there. No one ever answered. Instead, a massive predatory bird with a terrifying form would descend from the darkened sky, its wings creating a chilling wind. Overcome with fear, Meghna would run through the brambles, her breath coming in short gasps as the creature pursued her. Each time, the chase ended when she collided with a specific, ancient tree. This tree was unlike any other in the forest. From its twisted branches, a thick, glowing green liquid dripped slowly. The sight of it filled her with an inexplicable sense of dread and curiosity. Every morning at 9 o'clock, Meghna would wake up in her apartment, her heart racing and the image of the green liquid still burned into her mind. Her roommate and colleague, Ishita, was always there to pull her back to reality. Ishita was practical and energetic, often teasing Meghna about her long hours of sleep, unaware of the mental exhaustion the nightmares caused. The two women worked together in a high-stakes research laboratory where they were currently under immense pressure. Their supervisor, Professor Jaydev, was a demanding man who had tasked them with developing a groundbreaking antidote. His phone calls were frequent and stern, reminding them that they had already taken too much time and that results were expected immediately. During one particularly stressful afternoon at the lab, Ishita revealed that she had been looking into unconventional solutions to their research problem. She believed that modern science might find answers in the forgotten knowledge of the past. She produced an old, leather-bound book filled with accounts of ancient legends and folk remedies. Ishita began to talk about a substance described in the text as Mrityunjay Amrit, which translates to the nectar of immortality. According to the folklore, this rare liquid possessed extraordinary healing properties that could potentially provide the chemical breakthrough they needed for their antidote. Meghna was initially dismissive, viewing the idea of an immortality nectar as nothing more than a fairy tale. She told Ishita that they should focus on their chemical formulas rather than chasing myths. However, Ishita urged her to look at the book. When Meghna finally looked down at the page, the color drained from her face. There, in an old illustration, was the exact tree from her nightmares. The book described a tree located in a remote region that would release a mysterious green liquid every night of the full moon. The physical resemblance was perfect: the gnarled bark, the shape of the leaves, and the way the liquid pooled at the base. The realization that her private nightmares were documented in an ancient text shook Meghna to her core. She could no longer tell herself that her dreams were just the product of a tired mind. There was a connection between her subconscious and this legend that she could not explain. Sensing that this was more than a coincidence, Meghna agreed to Ishita's proposal. They decided that they would travel to the village mentioned in the legends to find the tree and see if the liquid was real. Meghna kept the truth about her dreams hidden, simply telling Ishita that she was intrigued by the scientific possibility. They packed their bags and prepared for a journey into the unknown. The next morning, they boarded a bus for a 5-hour trip to the remote village of Berempur in Madhya Pradesh. As the city of Delhi faded behind them, Meghna felt a growing sense of unease. She was heading toward the very place that had been haunting her sleep, unaware that she was walking into a village where the shadows of the past were beginning to stir once again. The 5-hour journey from the bustling city of Delhi to the remote village of Berempur felt like a transition into another world. As Meghna and Ishita stepped off the bus, they were greeted by a massive arched gateway with the name of the village etched across it in old, weathered letters. The moment they crossed the threshold into the village, the atmosphere shifted violently. The sweltering heat of the afternoon vanished, replaced by a sudden, unnatural chill. The sun was swallowed by thick, dark clouds, and a fierce wind began to howl, kicking up a blinding dust storm that swirled around the two women. Inside the village, the residents were equally alarmed by the sudden change in weather. The village head stood by the central well with his men, looking up at the sky with deep concern. He noted that it had been a hot day only moments before and feared that a heavy storm was imminent. When Meghna and Ishita reached the village square, they approached the village head. To avoid revealing their true mission regarding the green liquid, Ishita introduced them as students from the city who were conducting research on various historical villages for their studies. The village head, a kind-hearted man, welcomed them and offered them a place to stay in his own home, mentioning that his wife was very fond of young guests. As they walked into his house, a strange event occurred. The flame in the family's prayer temple suddenly flickered and died out. Unaware of this dark sign, the girls were introduced to the son of the village head, a young man named Anuj. Anuj seemed skeptical of their research and mocked the idea of finding anything interesting in their village, which he considered boring and outdated. While the girls were settling in, the village priest was performing a ritual at the local temple. Just as in the house, the temple lamp was suddenly extinguished by a cold draft. The priest stood in the darkness, trembling, as he sensed that these were not just weather patterns but signs of a deep, ancient evil returning to protect its secrets. He looked toward the darkening horizon, feeling a sense of dread that he had not felt in many years. He knew that such sudden changes in the natural world often preceded a great calamity. In the house, Ishita began her plan to gather information. She asked Anuj if there were any mysterious or historical sites nearby. Anuj told them about a grand palace located on the outskirts of the village that had belonged to a local king 4 centuries ago. Meghna felt a sharp jolt of recognition at the mention of the palace, though she had never been to this region before. They convinced Anuj to take them to the ruins secretly at midnight, ensuring that his parents would not find out about their late-night excursion. They believed that by exploring the historical sites, they might find a clue leading them to the tree from the legends. As midnight approached, the village grew silent, but it was a heavy, watchful silence. Anuj met the girls in the corridor, and they quietly slipped out of the house. As they walked through the narrow lanes, the wind grew even stronger, carrying with it a faint, rhythmic sound that the girls could not quite identify. Anuj joked that perhaps the pollution from the city had followed them in the form of a storm, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of nervousness. He had grown up with the stories of the village, and knew that the night was often a time when things were best left undisturbed. When they finally arrived at the gates of the ancient palace, Meghna stood frozen. The crumbling stone walls and the high, arched windows were identical to the structures she had seen in her dreams. They found a window with a broken latch, as the main doors had been jammed shut for centuries, and climbed inside. The interior was filled with dust and the scent of decay, but to Meghna, It felt like she was walking back into a memory from another life. Every shadow and every corner seemed to whisper to her, confirming that her presence here was not a coincidence. Meanwhile, back in the heart of the village, the priest's fears were realized. The sound of heavy, rhythmic footsteps began to echo through the empty streets, accompanied by a low, guttural chanting that made the very ground vibrate. The priest rushed to the home of the village head, waking him in a panic. He whispered that the ancient coffin bearers, who had been dormant for centuries, were once again roaming the paths of Berempur. Their return meant that the old curse had been triggered, and anyone caught outside would be in grave danger. Inside the decaying palace of King Suraj Ban, Meghna, Ishita, and Anuj moved through the shadows with only a small light to guide them. Every step they took on the ancient floorboards seemed to echo through the empty halls, amplifying the tension between them. Meghna felt an overwhelming sense of familiarity, as if she had walked these corridors in a different time, recognizing the patterns on the walls and the layout of the rooms before they even entered them. While Ishita was focused on the historical significance and the potential link to their scientific research, Meghna was drawn to the deeper, darker energy of the building. Suddenly, the heavy silence was shattered by the sound of boots patrolling the hallway. The three of them froze, listening to the rhythmic thudding that suggested a guard was making his rounds. Yet when they looked out into the corridor, it was completely empty. Far away from the palace, at the edge of the dark forest, two village men named Sampat and Kapta were sitting together. They had stayed out late, ignoring the growing storm and the warnings of the elders, distracted by a game of cards and their own stubbornness. The wind was so fierce that they could barely keep their eyes open, but through the swirling dust and debris, they heard a sound that made their blood run cold. It was the low, guttural chant they had heard in stories since childhood, a sound they never thought they would encounter in reality. Looking into the gloom, they saw four figures slowly emerging from the mist, carrying a heavy wooden coffin on their shoulders. The figures, known as the Nishir Molo, stopped directly in front of the two terrified men. Their eyes glowed with a menacing red light that pierced through the darkness and the dust. Sampat and Kapta were paralyzed by fear, unable to move their limbs or cry out for help as the entities stood over them like statues of doom. Back at the palace, a heavy wooden door suddenly swung open with a violent force, causing Meghna and her friends to jump in shock. The air in both locations grew heavy with the weight of an ancient curse that had finally been triggered after 400 years of silence, connecting the past to the present. At that very moment, the lid of the coffin carried by the four entities began to slide open with a chilling deliberation. A terrifying, high-pitched scream erupted from the forest, loud enough to be heard by every resident in the village of Berempur. The people in their homes huddled together in the dark, knowing that a dark event was unfolding that they could not stop. The scream marked a turning point in the mystery, signaling that the secrets of the past, the legend of the green nectar, and Meghna's recurring nightmares were all converging toward a single, terrifying truth that was about to be revealed.